So we are joined by a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University and a leading Bigfoot researcher, Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Thank you so much for joining me.
My
And
pleasure.
it's an absolute pleasure. I've been interested in the topic of Bigfoot for at least 15 years. Some of my earliest memories, I think, really is like watching TV shows like Monster Quest and Finding Bigfoot, in which you were in a lot of those. So
Yeah.
literally, like my earliest memories of Bigfoot is like watching you on TV, talk about the subject. So it's really cool to actually be able to chat with you.
Well, great. Yeah, it's been quite a journey, so glad to have shared it.
And I've actually communicated with you in the past. It's been a few years. I had some audio that I sent to you, and you connected me with David Ellis.
Oh,
And
good.
yeah, and I actually chat with him a lot. So he's a great guy, and I was able to interview him as well. So it was really cool.
Excellent. Excellent. That's good.
So talk a little bit about how you got. I mean, I've heard a little bit about it, but talk about how you got interested in the subject and kind of where that overlapped with your studies and how you're able to kind of involve it.
Well, sure, sure. Well, like you, at a very young age, I was intrigued by the topic. I'm of a generation, that generation that was really first exposed to this when, largely when the Patterson-Gimlin film came on the scene. And that famous piece of footage really had an impact. There were a few. There aren't many around now because they're several years my elder, where the mystique of the Himalayan expeditions and the occasional encounter with these enigmatic footprints in the snow, and of course the mysterious folklore of the Yeti and the abominable snowman, as it came to be known. And in fact, Roger Patterson dubbed his first book, North America, The Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life. No, I'm sorry, that was Sanderson. North America's Abominable Snowman, I think was what
Mhm.
Patterson was. Um, so there's certainly, I mean, certainly there was that connection. See, would have been about 10 years my senior, thereabouts. And so that probably had a more profound impact on him. But I happened to be living, as I've often mentioned, in Spokane, Washington, at the time that Roger first began to debut his documentary that showcased that amazing piece of footage, and that was my first exposure to the topic. I subsequently learned a lot more about other now, as we call them, relic hominoids,
Mhm.
in the vein of Dr. Boris Porzhnev, but it was only subsequently that I became aware of Ivan Sanderson's book, which had come out a little bit earlier, 1962 or 61, and just barely dovetailed with some of the happenings in California when that book was published. Just right on the heels of the publicity surrounding Jerry Crew with that famous shot
Yeah.
with him holding the footprint cast, and that was on newspaper front pages all over the place and magazines. Still gets a lot of mileage out of it because it's such a captivating image of that, some of those first encounters here
Right.
in the States. So things just kind of continued. I mean, as a youngster, I was the type, a little on the border of obsessive compulsive, I guess you could say. When I grappled with a topic, I really got all into it, and it was something. Instead of memorizing baseball stats, uh, I knew all about the different sightings and the people involved, and this, that, and the other. Could cite you line and chapter and verse from books by John Green and others. So that interest waxed and waned over the years, but it certainly had an impact, and eventually
Sure.
the writings of Dr. Krantz and his particular uh, incisive evaluation of the footprint evidence really had a tremendous impact on me. The biomechanical principles that he applied to trying to come to some grips and understanding those adaptations of a very large, excessively large biped certainly had an influence. And so I eventually, when I did eventually, as I sorted through various career path potentials and landed on a pathway into kind of tangentially at that time into anthropology and anatomy, it was the evolution of bipedalism that really fascinated me. This was a time too where, from high school graduation and on into college, where some have referred to it as the golden age of paleoanthropology. I think that was more egotistical and egocentric perspective, perhaps, but there was a lot of amazing revelations, including Lucy, and the fascination with the one of those early hominin bipeds and the footprints in Laetoli that are almost certainly attributable to that species. And a paper had been published by a group of scholars at SUNY Stony Brook, which was this big, thick reprint that I had received a copy of, on the locomotor anatomy of Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's type, and Lucy's ilk. And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to grapple with those fossils, the skeleton, and sleuth the meaning from those about those bones and the adaptations for bipedalism. And so that set me down that path, which put me in a very advantageous position when, again, it seemed like, whenever an opportunity, whenever something would cross my path, I was quick to kind of jump on that and take advantage of that. And so I was in a position when the chance came to actually get directly involved with some real evidence, some real data, first in the form of a piece of video footage, which has remained quite controversial, as they almost, well, yeah, they all do.
They all are. Yeah, they all are.
Even the Patterson film remains controversial, but I mean, all the evidence, I guess, yeah. But I mean, even amongst the Bigfoot community, but then shortly on the heels of that and kind of set in motion by those events, I had the privilege of actually examining footprints in the ground, an extensive trackway. And, that's not an opportunity that many are afforded.
Yeah.
And to have, 35, 45 clear tracks in the mud. And yeah, I mean, just it was as if it was meant to be in a way, and that really set the hook. I could not imagine walking away from the subject, given my background, given the preparation, the serendipity of the event, and all. There was just too much. It was just yeah. So anyway, I always try to think of a different little detail or insight to go with that story, because I'm sure many of your listeners have heard it ad nauseum, but it's I mean, it's amazing, and it's with me, it's fresh every time with the retelling. I contemplate taking in those tracks, and still the hair stands up on my neck because that realization struck me at that moment. My gosh, a Sasquatch just walked by here last night. A real Sasquatch. I mean, at that point, because of my familiarity, because of the expertise, it wasn't just Joe Blow off the street looking at some scuff marks in the mud. I mean, it was me with all the years of study and preparation and investigation and so on and so on, evaluating these unmistakable. There was no middle ground. They either were hoaxed or they were real.
Right.
And, they were that distinct. So there was no ambiguity. And seeing it that way and weighing it, people will have and will continue to accuse me of being biased, being unable to evaluate it objectively because I had this history. I was sort of predisposed to interpret these in a particular way. And I challenge anyone with such an opinion to put their expertise, if they have the acumen, where their accusations are, and contradict the evaluation of that evidence and all that has followed since then. The model, the distinctive model of the Sasquatch foot that has emerged from the evidence of those initial tracks and all of the successive accumulation of footprint evidence that I have been preoccupied with since then. So there's a
Now,
new book.
that trackway you're talking about, what I think those were the ones that were on Finding Bigfoot, right?
Yeah, they were mentioned, yes, and
Yeah. You were
it,
on the hill with them, I think, like on top of
yes,
the mountain or whatever. Yeah, I remember
during
that.
the whiteout, yeah, during that whiteout where you couldn't see anything but the snow as far.
Yep. That was it.
It was yeah, it was literally whiteout. There was no horizon. It was like standing against a portrait backdrop with just pure white. It was pretty interesting weather. But yeah, that was there, and also they're featured and discussed at length in the introductory pages of my book,
Mhm.
Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. So yeah, they've been well, and I've had presented them at meetings. I've published on them, and they have also formed the basis of the description, in part referenced in the description to the ichnotaxonomy of the footprints, attaching a name to the footprints themselves, not to the species, but to the footprints. Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought it was really cool. I just remember watching that, and you had different photos, and you were talking about like the toe drags and the
Oh yeah.
different ways that the foot move and how hard it would be to actually hoax that.
Oh yeah. You would have to have several sets of fake feet because, I mean, unless you had a fully animatronic device
Right.
that would allow you to extend and flex the toes appropriately and had midfoot flexibility that would produce the uh, pressure ridge or extrusion features that would allow you to run on the front half of the foot and leave just a half track flexing at that transverse tarsal joint. I mean, the sophistication that would have been required. I mean, people
Right.
don't realize this, and this is what's always funny, when the Wallace story broke and the claims were laid out there and gobbled up, like a duck on a June bug, as the saying goes, by the press, that here was a simple explanation that accounted for all of this questionable footprint evidence. It was just simply these yokels donning these carved wooden feet, clumsily strapped to their shoes and trotting off footprints in the mud or the whatever, the dust. And then to see, I mean, I just had to laugh. There's the one story that I watched where the journalist is standing in the field, and where there's some mud to be had. And as he's telling the story and so forth, and the narration, his feet have had a chance to kind of suck down into the mud a little bit. And then with his closing remarks, he turns to walk away to demonstrate how this was all done. And what happens? Well, if you've ever been in mud with a boot, let
Yeah.
alone a snowshoe-sized platform, it just glommed onto that mud, and he just about pitched head over straight, did a face plant, and was eventually able to extricate one of his feet, but it brought up literally 2 inches of mud adhered to the bottom of those carved wooden feet and left not a nice, pristine footprint like I was documenting, but rather this crater, featureless crater, which was left after pulling all this mud up with the shoe. And so, I mean, if it with just a little reflection to pause and reflect on the logistics what would be involved in perpetrating such a hoax?
Right.
It's not a simple undertaking. Otherwise, someone would have, well, I don't know, what was it, $1,000, $10,000 that John Green offered as a bounty for anyone who could
You're right.
demonstrate how it had been done. No one has that reward in their pockets, so bank account.
What when you look at a good like possible Bigfoot footprint, like what are some characteristics you're looking for to rule out like a person, for example?
Right. Well, ruling out a person is pretty straightforward. If I mean, with some minor potential exceptions, and obviously the first and foremost is the size. If you're dealing with 14 and a half, 15-inch footprints, like at the Patterson Gimlin film site, or in my case, the tracks that I witnessed that were just a little over 14 inches as well, um, that rules out 99% of the human population. There just
Right.
aren't people with that long of feet, and let alone that broad. So the breadth is another very exclusive feature that is part of the adaptation to accommodate this very large body mass, which scales at a faster rate than does the surface area of the foot. So there has to be disproportionate enlargement and alteration. So instead of an arched foot, as in a human, um, and humans that don't have arched feet, that have flat feet, it usually results in a cascade of other uh, expressions of anatomy, namely the pronation, the rolling inward of the ankles to press that arch downward, which gives the foot a very different shape, contour. And so the presence of an arch with a narrow heel and a well differentiated ball, especially under the base of the big toe, as opposed to the Sasquatch foot, which is relatively featureless in that sense of the topography. It's quite flat and broad, and no differential compression under the heel and under the ball of the foot. Um, so and then you've got things like the toes. Most people have worn uh, rather confining shoes through their lifetime, and as a result, the toes, even when freed from that confinement, remain quite compressed. And in fact, the little toe is often so compressed that it typically is turned over on its side. So the nail is facing sideways instead of upwards. And that's a real easy tell. I mean, just if it's present, you know. If it's not, then you have to take that into account, because there are a lot of people who, try to avoid wearing shoes, or who have worn more sensible shoes, or wear, when they run, for example, the toed running shoes, which then tend to separate and straighten out the toes a bit, and introduce a little more splay and downward direction of the pads of the toes. Um, so whether, if someone's wearing those, if there's not a giveaway logo or insignia or pattern
Right.
on someone recently sent me some tracks, and the heel had very distinctive wavy lines. It had a tread mark,
Right.
and the toes for these shoes tend to have sort of a wedge shape, sort of a flared contour. And so if you looked at a few pair, and or the footprints that are left by someone wearing them, you get a search image, and you can readily recognize the rather distinctive appearance of those toes. But so the toes are distinctive. The Sasquatch toes tend to be more subequal. The difference in area of the toe pads, especially from the first separated from the second, third, fourth, fifth in a human, is quite a distinctive uh, appearing feature. And so you got this big toe pad, and then the second toe is usually set up and a little high relative to that large pad, but much smaller, a third the size. And whereas Sasquatch toes are more, there is differentiation between the big toe. I mean, certainly their foot is derived from an antecedent anatomy that was very similar, a grass climbing 8 foot that had enlarged the big toe as a pincher opposite the lateral toes.
Right.
So that's why even after losing divergence, differentiation of the big toe in a thumb-like manner, it still has its own set of muscles and its own distinctive tendon and flexor tendon and so forth, even though it's now bound to the others by a deep transverse ligament that binds the heads of the metatarsals together. So it's pretty straightforward.
Sure.
Although, there are people who, I mean, I continually get, and I appreciate people sharing. I'd rather them share having misidentified a human footprint, especially as is so often the case, they think it's in an unlikely place for a human to be walking barefoot. You cannot just simply accept that appearance, whether it's you or whether it's someone telling you that. You just cannot accept it at face. I mean, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it doesn't matter if it's in your bathtub or if it's in the pond, it's still a duck. And so you've got to evaluate it on the basis of the features that differentiate it from one from another. And so, I get this on a very regular basis, and you need to choose your area too. If you're in an area that's a frequent location for recreationalists that are going to be enjoying the nice squishy mud between their toes, like a drawn down reservoir, a floodplain, or not a
Right.
floodplain, but the mud flats at the head
Sure.
of a drawn down reservoir, or a seasonally filling or emptying lake. And there's a few places like that, and some people out there will know exactly what I'm talking about. That they're people tracks. It's just funny. The Sasquatch there never grow feet that are any bigger than like 10 to 11 inches in length. They never get bigger than that for some reason. There's just something in the water, I guess, it stunts their growth. But
So from what I've seen from like possible footprints, and I have seen one possible one in the field, and actually since your picture, this has been several years ago, but it seems like, well, what do you think the comparison is for like the proportions of length versus the width of possible Bigfoot? Because I mean, they're wider, right? Like a
yes,
Bigfoot foot is
yeah,
quite a bit wider.
yes. Well, for example, let's see. And you're catching me flat-footed here. I'm not great with pulling the numbers out, but like on a 14 and a half, 15, Patty's foot, for example. And she tends to exemplify, uh, I think she exemplifies a female foot. And there
Sure.
is slight sexual dimorphism in not only in size, but in proportionality. So those that are readily attributable to females in the 13 to 15-inch range, thereabouts, tend to be more parallel sided. They tend to be a little narrower. So a 14, 15-inch foot will have a breadth of about 5 inches. You never get one that's more than half the length. The breadth is half of the length. If they start, when they get that square, either there's some deformation and some mismeasurement. That happens. Sometimes the sides slide on a bit of an angle. They take a step and
Right.
the foot sort of slips, or they've sunk rather deeply, and you need to take the break point, where the sidewalls come in. There can be some cratering that results. And if you measure way up here, it gives you a false impression. You need to come down where the break point is to the actual surface of contact of the sole of the foot, and take the measure from those break points, then rather than way up here at the top. And this is a guideline that's used by trackers of not only man trackers but animal trackers as well, when they're reporting the dimensions of a particular footprint, because otherwise your measurements can vary tremendously depending on how deeply they impress. I mean, there already is a little bit of potential variation because a very light footprint that doesn't impress very deeply may give you an artificially narrow dimension, uh, uh, as opposed to one that has sunk into the substrate more deeply. So the Patty, hers is almost 15 inches in length and let's see, 5 to 7 inches. I'd have to pull out a cast. But then what I think is the big male of that region, the same one we talked about, Jerry Crew
Hmm.
holding the cast up. It's the same footprint that was cast by Roger Patterson in 63 and by Bob Titmus in 62 and at Chaim Palm and so on and so on. 62, I think, or 64 maybe. Anyway, its foot is a full 16 to 17 inches in length, depending on how you measure it, which example you measure. But it has a more flaring outline. It's broader, both across the heel, but also disproportionately broader across the forefoot. And I think that reflects the sexual dimorphism in body mass, that even though that individual is probably, a 17-inch foot would equate to an 8.5, perhaps 9-foot tall male, whereas Patty's just under 7 foot, and she weighs 700 pounds. The male would weigh close to 1,200 pounds, and of that size. The foot has to keep up with that body mass, so that 1.5 foot additional height on that male, as we pointed out, equates to about 500 additional pounds. And so that weight has to be accommodated by the proportions, the dimensions of the foot.
That makes
So they're
sense.
disproportionately wider. But as with most biological populations, there's a lot of overlap between the means and ranges for the two sexes. And so you might have some individuals that it's kind of hard to tell. And then, of course, there's the age. Does a young male have a foot that is this of similar proportion for when it's in its length is passing through the size range of a female, or are they, if you look at a young juvenile male gorilla, they're kind of lean and lanky. It's not until they get that burst of testosterone as they become sexually mature and aged a bit that they bulk out and
Right.
put on that massive difference in that difference in mass and proportionality.
When you look at like a really good footprint, can you get anything as far as like the texture of the foot from that?
Well,
So for
sure.
example, I mean, a person, every person has a unique fingerprint. Is there
Right.
anything like that with a footprint that
Yes.
you can see?
Yes. But it's the examples that we have to draw upon and the extent of the preservation of the dermatoglyphics, the skin ridge detail on the footprints is very limited because you need very, appropriate conditions, conducive conditions to the transfer of that ridge detail to the surface. And that's assuming it's nice and clear. Again, a foot, if you've looked at some people, who was it? Peter Byrne used to show a picture of a Sherpa that the soles of their feet that he took a snapshot of. Excellent photograph. This person with really thick sole pad skin. I mean, so thick, in fact, that it was cracking in places. And yet you get up in certain spots and up close, and you can see that fine textured dermatoglyphics is still there. But when you get that hyper thick skin, which we have the potential for on our hands and our feet, but we don't often realize it when we're not, we're not laboring or working with our hands or walking barefoot under rough conditions. So you have to have so the point being is the expression of the dermatoglyphics on the foot can vary. You can imagine something like a Bigfoot to have some chafing, some thickening, some callousing, and so forth. I mean, you can look and to qualify that, because I don't want people to find that picture of Peter by Peter Byrne of the Sherpa and think that that's the way all humans or other animals that have dermatoglyphics like chimps and gorillas. If you see them in the wild, and even in captivity, I mean, on captivity, they spend a lot of time walking around on cement, can be rather abrasive and callus forming. And yet still, they have quite well expressed, well developed dermatoglyphics. You have to have the proper substrate to transfer that to the footprint. That can be either a wet clay soil or even a dry, dusty, pulverized, powdery substrate, like on the logging road. Or around here, we have deposits of this glacial silt called loess, which is just the consistency of flour. In fact, it's called sometimes glacial flour. And huge deposits that have been blown around during the Ice Age. So you'll have deposits that are 6, 7, 8 feet thick in places. And when you cut a road into that, it's just like tearing open a bag of flour and turning the fan on,
Right.
um, and even in other places. I mean, like if the logging roads or the Forest Service roads have not been well improved, then that dirt gets pulverized by the passage of vehicles, so that each time a car goes by, it just cloud of dust rains down on everything. And you can walk up to a nice little spot on there and take your hand, just for example, and you can, or just your thumbprint, and you can make a print and see all the details of the lines, ridges and grooves. And but then the next step is you've got to find the print soon enough before gravity and vibration or rain or other weathering elements will literally obliterate that fine detail.
Right.
Then you've got to mix up your plaster just right, so good consistency. And if it's like in the dust, just the act of pouring will cause artifacts, will cause disruption. So in that case, you've got to consolidate using like something like a lacquer hairspray in a moister, something like a wet clay soil. Then you can usually get those fine details to transfer to the cast, and so on. Each step of the process, there's potential. People get in there too eager with a stiff bristle brush to clean off all that offending dirt, and they introduce grooves and scratches and things that are misinterpreted as hieroglyphics. So that happens on occasion as well.
I guess
So
my second part of that question was going to be, and I think you may have already answered this. So say you find a juvenile print
yeah,
in an area, and then say 3 years later you find a bigger print. Is
yeah.
there a way to look at those two and say this is the same individual?
Well, you can. I mean, obviously, with growth, there's going to be changes in proportion and shape,
Yeah.
and so you'll never know for sure. But I mean, we have a few examples. There are some prints of youngsters in the blues outside of Walla Walla, where the conditions were and still are in many places particularly conducive to the documentation of footprints. This is an area with extensive loess deposits, and so in the areas where the roads are still tertiary and they've never laid down gravel beds, they make excellent tracking beds. And anything that walks along the shoulder or crosses the road leaves excellent footprints if they're discovered before the dust or before the meltwater or whatever the circumstances of the season are. Um, so we have some examples like that, as you mentioned, where we have little ones that several years later, there are prints of something that's inch and a half bigger, suggesting that it might be the same individual on a growth trajectory. That's on my to-do list of things, is to kind of look for examples and provide examples of smaller individuals. Dr. Bindernagel treated it briefly in his book, and I provided him with some very good, clear examples from the collection, especially from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla. But no one's really shown or tried to demonstrate recognizable. And when it comes to the dermatoglyphics, we have, of the, say, 300 footprint casts I have in my lab, we have maybe, a half a dozen to 10 or 11 that show some discernible dermatoglyphic features. None of them, where we have examples of repeat appearances of individuals that are recognizable based on the shape, size, proportion, none of them have well enough preserved replicated patches of dermatoglyphics to say, oh, look, based on these features that we would use to identify, dermatoglyphic characteristics, this is the same as this individual. We don't have any examples of that. So it's, it's one of those titillating things, but it's a very thin slice, a very little peephole in the stadium fence that gives us a little glimpse, but not a whole lot. I mean, basically, the bottom line is we know these are primates.
Sure.
They're not mutated bears, for example, because they not only do they have the morphology and lack the features of a bear, for example, but they have dermatoglyphics that are absolutely characteristic of primates, higher primates.
And I guess the reason why I was asking that question was because like with the audio, like I said, I've communicated a lot with David Ellis, and
Yeah.
there was a circumstance in which I had sent him an audio, a vocal that I recorded, and then like 3 years later, I sent him another one, and he was able to look at both of them and say that's the same individual.
Ah,
So I thought it was cool, and I was just wondering, and
yeah,
you answered that question about footprints, so
right. Well, it would be the similar basis. He's
yeah,
working off of a sonograph that is a visual print of the decibels and frequency and duration of a particular vocalization in a very graphic, quantified fashion. And so it's like a fingerprint. And so if you
sure,
can show another individual, they're either great mimics of one another or they have a very stereotypical vocalization, or in fact, they are the same individual. If you're confident enough in the identity of that voice print, so to speak.
right, absolutely. So you're talking a little bit about like castings. I know a new form of technology has kind of come into us with the scanners. Do you
Right.
think that captures the footprint better than a cast?
Well, it in some ways yes, in other ways no. I mean, other ways you really, there is something to be had by uh, a three-dimensional positive. I mean, because there are undercuts and there are features and so forth that are sometimes difficult to observe easily in an imprint in the ground. Now, if you do have the wherewithal, whether it's LiDAR on your iPhone Pro or a scanning camera to a three-dimensional camera scanner, you can create a model. And if you get the proper, sufficient density, and I've seen this with the LiDAR, you have to really saturate. But if you do that sufficient enough, then you can literally turn your scan over and it's as if you have a cast.
Right.
And I had an argument one time, one of the few times I had an opportunity to converse with Barbara Wasson, yeah, um, who fancied herself a tracker. She had taken a tracking course. Now that doesn't, I mean, having taught students, just because someone completes a course does not make them an expert on that topic. And we had a little bit of a disagreement because she was of the mind that if there was nothing you could learn from a cast that you couldn't learn from the footprint itself. The prima facie footprint was the primary source of all of your observations, and I respectfully but very pointedly disagreed with her, because there are things that really only come to your eye when you look at that cast. You pull that cast out of the ground and clean it off, and eventually, you look at it and you can see features that weren't necessarily evident. Even if it's just a matter of getting the lighting with a flashlight just right, that it brings out the topography, it brings out a streak
Right.
of a toenail or something. There are features. So that's the only qualification I have, is the 3D scans are great, and what a boon, instead of now having to schlep around several pounds of plaster and water, because you never know. Even if you're in a place where there's lots of water, the nearest water may be 300 yards down the slope at the creek down there. And so if you can just do a scan, and you've got the wherewithal and the practice, and that's the key. Practice, practice, practice. Don't let that first Sasquatch print be the first time that you experiment with your LiDAR, and get sufficient. It takes a while, and you got to get down around under all those angles and all the undercuts, and you think you have to. When you think you've taken enough, then take a few dozen more images to completely saturate. And but they're amazing. I mean, the detail that you can capture is really stunning.
I was watching a video of you. I think it was like 5 years ago. It was in your laboratory. You were looking at some footprints, and you had a footprint from another country, and it looked completely different. I think it was Nepal. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Sure.
the footprint
Yeah.
looked completely different. Like, is there how many different like variations of like? I mean that's completely
Right.
different than the footprint in North America. Like, how many
That's
different variations have you seen that are like compelling and look legit?
at least four, and that's kind of just building on,
Hmm.
extending the themes that were actually established by Ivan Sanderson back in the 60s. He ended up with four categories, and while I think those four are still remain justified, and are legitimate, some of them, like he had what he called proto-pygmies, which included things like the orang pendek. But he had these other creatures in South America and in other places that he had lumped into that category. Now, that there's problems with just biogeographics of that kind of lumping together, but uh, I think those four for those four, there's pretty reasonable footprint evidence that also distinguishes the four groups. Now, there's a couple, and those include the Sasquatch and its its cohort, which includes a circum-Pacific distribution, and in fact, all the way through, especially southern Asia, up beyond the Himalayas, clear to the Caucasus Mountains. And those footprints, and we've got probably a half a dozen or more now examples of those, including the really stunning examples from China that I was able to examine, which are virtually indistinguishable. If I shuffled them in amongst a sample of Sasquatch tracks, most people wouldn't be able to single them out as being particularly different. Then you've got, as you said, those from Nepal, and you, through the process of elimination, uh, by uh, by identifying the absolutely clearly misidentified bear tracks, which is a significant fraction, 20, 30%. Then there's a big chunk, 40, 60%, that are indistinguishable, unintelligible, just melted out, sublimated. Um, who knows? There's nothing, no anatomy that can be discerned with reliability. And then it boils down to just two or three examples that include the Shipton, the famous Shipton, which, though, if it's legit, is a pathology, a deformation of the foot, which there is a remarkable analogy to be drawn with a human condition known as macrodactyly that causes disproportionate enlargement of especially the first and second digits. And I mean, I can show you images of young people because usually it's corrected in infancy and they grow out of it. But I can show you images, photographs from orthopedic textbooks, which are uncannily identical, similar to the appearance of the Shipton footprint. And then there's the McNeely-Cronin expedition footprint, which also has, which essentially looks like a chunky chimpanzee with a divergent big toe and rather subequal uh, thick lateral digits. And there's a couple of others to be added to that. Hutchison has a photograph of a print that's remarkably similar to the McNeely-Cronin print. So it's obviously then an arboreal species or semi-terrestrial. Its feet have a grasping big toe. Its tracks are found in the snow where it's crossing over a pass from one subtropical
Mhm.
valley to another. Um, then you've got um, the Almasti, which is probably, especially given its distribution, a relic Neanderthal, possibly Denisovan, who knows what other species are going to be added to that mix. And it does have an arched foot, a broad, chunky, arched foot, splayed toes, but in the human size range, because they're not of gigantic stature. The
Right.
Neanderthals were rather squat and stout. And then, as I mentioned, the orang pendek. And there's some controversy a little bit. Some of the classic footprints attributed to the orang pendek have a non-divergent big toe, very narrow kind of tapered heel. But then there have been some prints attributed to the orang pendek that have had. Maybe there's more than one species in this region. Maybe there's a because the one track, if it is a footprint, and I think it's actually a handprint, it's one Adam Davis's track. If that is a footprint, then it's a form of orangutan
Mhm.
because it has an extremely short heel. It has this divergent big toe and these rather long lateral toes. Um, well, not that long now that I'm thinking about it. But anyway, now there's some other interesting things. There's been reports, a recent interesting book by, oh, shucks. Let's see, I'm again flat-foot. I'm terrible now. Patterson, is it? Garrett Patterson
Mhm.
from the mountains in South Africa, which might be a relic Australopithecine of some sort. You know, there's the Ogagwe, I think, is up in eastern central Africa. There's some others that of which we have a few anecdotes. I mean, if you look if you look on some of these websites, there was one I came upon, and the person had done an exhaustive literature search, apparently, but there was must have been 200 names of humanoid, man-like monsters that were on every continent, including, well, and then there's the Yowie. We didn't mention the Yowie. Sanderson avoided the Yowie as well. I avoided it in my first book. I did tackle it in a little activity booklet that tried to summarize the conundrum that it presents and the conflated evidence, which was summarized in one page. For me, the litmus test is the footprints. And that's what we kind of focused on tonight. And on that one page, I just made a collage of a drawing or sketch or tracing of every footprint I could find that has been attributed to the Yowie. And there are no two that are the same, going from 3 toes to 5 toes, from little narrow tiny things to great big ponderous club-footed things that are obviously hoaxed. But there's a lot of hoaxing, a lot of misidentification, a
Right.
lot of a lot of misconstrued impressions of things. So, but it's a fascinating. I mean, this is right in step now with we now know that the tree of both the hominins and the hominoids, the apes and human ancestors and relatives, is just gets bushier almost yearly with species added. And so And some of those, some very attention grabbing, like Homo naledi, and but other things that have persisted until very recently in the known fossil record, if not into the present. Uh, we now have a context for relic hominoid species. They should exist. This notion that they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, is completely outdated now, has been for a couple of decades or more, and but there's no justification for it at this point.
So obviously, I mean, you do a lot of research, but how much would you say you actually go out in the field? And a second part to that question, have you ever had any kind of encounter or
Yeah.
experience with what you believe is a Bigfoot?
Yeah, well, from very early on, one of my first um, opportunities was provided by Richard Greenwell and the International Cryptozoology Society, with funding from a Japanese film company that was shooting a documentary that financed a major undertaking, which was quite unusual. We went into the Siskiyou Wilderness. We were just one ridge over from the Patterson-Gimlin film site,
Hmm.
and spent a full month in the field. And since then, and we had some kind of close encounters. We had things in camp. We had things brushing against the tents. We had things vocalizing, stealing food, so forth, brushing against the tents. And since then, since I have the good fortune of a job that only nails my foot to the office 9 months out of the year, the remainder of my time is very flexible for research projects, including field work. I would spend up to at least a month at a time, if not, and then more otherwise, on an annual basis. So, when people accuse me of being this armchair investigator, I've
Hmm.
probably spent more time in the field. I mean, I'm not out there on every weekend type of a thing, but because I'm not surrounded by appropriate habitat to do research in my backyard, unfortunately. Close, but not quite.
Right.
Anyway, so yes, and I have had some close encounters, and I've found footprints on a half a dozen occasions. I've heard vocalizations. I've caught glimpses. I caught a glimpse. Let's put it that way. Recently, about 3 years ago now,
Oh,
up
wow.
up in Alberta, caught a glimpse of something through night vision binocular, but unfortunately we weren't set up for recording or camera traps or anything at that moment. Even if it would have been successful. But so yeah, I do get out in the field. I know what it's like to do that kind of field work, and the rather tediousness nature of it, because there's not a lot of positive reinforcement. I mean, other than the process itself, which I love.
Yeah, sure.
Doing that wilderness camping and lots of hiking and backpacking. I mean, I've put lots and lots of miles and lots of pairs of boots, and broken in lots and lots of equipment, and tried all sorts of instruments, and had you know, all of the mishaps and curses of Bigfoot, batteries dying inexplicably, and all that, which I won't venture to try to explain, other than it happens. And but yeah. Now, what was the second half of your question?
I think you answered it. If you've
Oh,
ever had an
oh yeah.
experience or seen one, and you answer that, and that brings up an interesting point. You're talking about like batteries dying, and I was going to ask about that. So you hear a lot of stories about people, they can't record or their cameras freeze up,
Yeah.
and I've heard people like, as far as like I think the best scientific approach to that I've heard is like, infrasound, can affect things. I don't know. Like, so do you
Yeah.
have any,
Yeah.
have you dug into that all? Like, do you have any explanation of what you think could be causing that?
Yeah. Well, I my own experiences, I would be hard pressed to be convinced that they were not just, though. I mean, cold weather can drain batteries, and
Sure.
we've been in extreme conditions, and I've been in situations in high elevation camps and so forth where one day you're sweltering in 90-degree weather, and the next day you're shivering under a tarp because with 6 inches of snow all around you. And overnight temperatures can suck the life out of battery systems, and we use a lot of rechargeables, which are notoriously unreliable, at times. So I'm quite reluctant to. I've not sat and experienced, as some people have described to me, sticking a battery and watching the gauge go as if
You're
there's
right.
some dampening effect, some pull. I don't know any mechanism by which infrasound could affect electromagnetic fields. We're
Right.
getting into the way into the woo at that point,
Yeah, sure.
if that were the case. I mean, I think there's a biological basis for the physiologic effects of um, an animal directing infrasound at you. I mean, because there's precedent. There are predators that employ infrasound to stun their prey.
Sure.
And there's documentation of the susceptibility of chemoreceptors in the brain to particular frequencies of sound that can stimulate those receptors. Doesn't take a molecular ligand, and instead a vibration can and elicit various emotional responses that would otherwise have been, hormonally or neurochemically mediated. So those things, again, you don't have to resort to paranormal. It's just that we don't fully understand the
Sure.
basis for some of those things. And um, given the evidence of the presence of extralaryngeal air sacs, which have been attributed by some authors to contributing to the production of infrasound in some of these creatures. They've now demonstrated that gorillas do produce infrasound.
Hmm.
When I wrote my book, I could only speculate that might be the case. And so now, almost two decades later, it has been demonstrated in the laboratory that yes, gorillas do generate infrasound. And there's actually been a CT study of the extensiveness of some of the air sac systems in um, orangutans. Now, if Sasquatch is nested amongst the Asian apes, and that's not a given, it could be either one. I mean, the great apes, all the hominoids have extralaryngeal air sacs except us, and we only have them on rare occasion atavistically as a kind of a vestigial organ sometimes that pops up. And the rationale, the most recent paper that I read, the rationale has been offered for the loss of the laryngeal air sacs was attributed to achieving greater control, neuromuscular control of the pharynx and the vocal mechanism in the production of sounds that have now been facilitated by our dropped larynx and expanded pharynx, including the formation of clear consonant sounds, which is distinctive of the human vocalizations, and which um, apes like chimps can only uh, roughly, lip popping things like mama, where all it is the lips being pressed together. What was her name? Vicky. Vicky the chimpanzee was raised as an experiment with a human family from infancy to see if that constant contact and exposure and interaction would promote her acquisition of human articulate speech. And by the time she was, I don't know, 3, 4 years old, the only word she could really utter was mama, mama. And that was it. So we're getting off now, but the point being is it's an interesting corollary to the extralaryngeal air sacs, but the point was that the reason we've lost them is because being able to produce infrasound, or well, the presence, not the infrasound itself, but the
Right.
presence of the air sacs is somehow entangled with the lack of ability to form consonant sounds and the proper vowel sounds, which great apes can approximate but have a limited range of expression. So anyway, so again, but my point, I guess the one thing just to emphasize is that these discussions don't need to resort to extraordinary explanations. They can be readily discussed, accommodated, inferences drawn based on analogy with living great apes and modern humans, and with the known anatomy and physiology. You don't have to. Now, I've learned to never say never. Um, but my personal experience, and I'll keep
Right,
repeating,
sure.
is simply that these things don't happen in my presence. So, and I've had people who say, "Well, it's your doubting, your lack of faith, your lack of open-mindedness that just puts the kibosh on it." And that again defies natural explanation. But because I'd be, I'd be delighted to experience some of these things. I'd be delighted to see some little bouncing balls of light
You're
and
right.
see a Sasquatch, snuff into non-existence, stepping through a portal or whatever. But hey, every time I'm invited, even in the areas where these things are supposed to happen on a regular basis, I'm the wet blanket, I guess. It never happens in my presence. So, uh, it's just, I had one, and I'll just give this one example because it was so illustrative of what, when you hold the allegation or assertion to a higher standard of evidence. This person was going on and on and on with me about orbs being associated with Sasquatch. And I go, well, do you have any pictures? Have you documented this? And oh yeah. I mean, that was not he didn't take that as an affront or a challenge at all. Oh yeah, I've got pictures. Well, would you send me one? Send me your best picture. Don't send me your worst, and then build, to prepare me, because I always hate it when people, when I receive a piece of evidence and I'm a little critical of it, and they go, oh, well, I've got better footprints, or I've got better.
Right.
Well, why don't you put that best? I make your most persuasive argument. So he sent me a photograph, or sent me an image online, and it was a flash photograph at night in their camp underneath ponderosa pine trees that were pollinating. If you've ever been out, sometimes it's like a blizzard when all these pollen is being blown in the
Sure.
wind, and you
Right.
take a flash with that and it illuminates every single little. And I said, no, let me make sure that I'm interpreting what you're sharing with me. Each of these little white dots is an orb. Yep, that was his orb experience. And so, I mean, I've been in cases where I've had to turn my headlamp off because it was literally a whiteout. You get so much reflection off of this pollen that you just cannot see unless you just turn your light. Anyway, but like I said, I think it would be a fascinating, interesting dimension to this whole phenomenon.
Yeah.
Uh, but if there's any appropriate application of the principle of parsimony, which does not say that the least complicated, the simplest explanation is more likely to be true. It just says that until you can reject the simpler explanation, until you have some basis, some rational basis for saying, well, this can't be, therefore we have to make our explanation a little more convoluted, a little more complicated, rather, add some other variable to account for what we're experiencing or observing. You're obligated to stick with the simplest. And so far, I have not experienced, nor has anyone presented evidence that would negate the simpler explanation that this is simply a biological species of unrecognized higher primate that walks like us, but does virtually nothing else quite like us. So, um, until we can kick the legs out from underneath that explanation, there's no justification. You know, you have to scrutinize very critically, very objectively, all these claims of, you know, inexplicably ending lines of footprints, or Sasquatch just disappearing. You know, you look away for a second and it's gone. Well, duh. There's so many. I mean, that happens with animals so often. If you look away, they just wait for that chance for you to
Yeah.
break eye contact, and then they slip away. That's their strategy. You freeze until your threat is distracted. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so
Oh no,
I'll
you're good. No, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but like obviously, like I've dealt with criticism just being interested in the subject, and
yeah.
I'll go out in the field a few times each month. And yourself, being in the scientific community, and you probably don't deal with it as much as you may have when you started kind of your research, but like how have you kind of dealt with that criticism and addressed it?
Yeah. Well, and the criticism has actually waned somewhat, or taken on a slightly different tone, and I think that comes with the persistence that I've exhibited, as well as, but it's not just raw persistence. It's I have gone to great lengths to present an a fair, open-minded, but also objective and rational and critical presentation of the evidence. And there is sufficient, there's insufficient evidence to demonstrate conclusively, or to convince someone of the existence of these creatures on the basis of the evidence alone. And that's not my goal. But as a scientist, my goal is to present the evidence that does point to the very real possibility. I mean, well, like I said, we're kind of beyond the possibility, the probability that these creatures exist. Something is leaving footprints. Something is shedding hair that can't be identified. Something is vocalizing that leaves voice prints that don't match up with coyotes and
Yeah, sure.
dogs and so forth. You know, there are sources for this evidence that are not recognized by mainstream science. And so my goal is to be sure that that door is held open, and uh, scientists and public and individuals, non-scientists alike, um, who express an interest, or have an interest in the subject, can get reliable uh, treatment of the evidence, and can grapple with the question, and that perhaps their own experiences. That's the thing, and that's why I'm a little bit. I can be sometimes, my patience and uh, my readiness to criticize in a objective way, in a professional way, the nonsense that gets perpetuated is becoming a bit more pointed, more
Yeah.
less patient, because I'm reaching that point where my influence is beginning to wane. My influence, my involvement, will eventually have to begin to wane, as we were talking about doing field work. Unfortunately, I've had experienced health concerns that have greatly limited my mobility in the field, and so forth. And so, and I'm reaching a point, just as Dr. Krantz did before me, where I'm kind of looking about for an heir apparent, and preferably one that's in academia that can keep that door ajar. Likewise, but it may take a few more years. I think we're seeing some changes. I've seen indications of interest in the upcoming generation of scholars that have not been indoctrinated, or have not been, but still are under the thumb of the gatekeepers of my generation. There's still the lingering deans and department chairs and society presidents, and and journal editors and so forth that are not inclined to give this an open-minded, objective opportunity. But give it a couple, 3 or 4 more years as those people gain tenure and this subsequent new upcoming generation gain tenure, start to fill some of those positions. We have a few out there, but there's no one who's really expressed interest to step up. And
Right.
yeah.
In the past, like I said, I've communicated with you via email. Like I remember sending you a possible footprint. This is a couple years ago, and I remember you sent a map of black bears and kind
Oh,
of where they are in the
yeah,
United States. Tell a little bit about what you think that correlation is between
yeah,
black bears and Bigfoot.
right. Remind me, what state are you in?
Indiana. I'm in Indiana.
Indiana, yeah. Well, um, this grew out of a couple of observations. And, I was just reviewing, in fact, today, because I was looking for the page where he actually states, in Dr. Krantz's book, where he actually states his notion of what he thinks proportions of bear to Sasquatch. Although he's a little bit on a slightly different page because he's using a comparison to grizzly bears based on their size, but there's huge differences in their ecology that grizzlies are much more specialized in some ways than black bears being more generalized. But and so the more interesting comparisons, the broader, and given the much more limited distribution of grizzly bears versus black bear, I think in the face of reports that are much more of Sasquatch that are more extensively distributed. So recently there was a paper, well, not that recently, it's been a number of years now, Lozier et al. One of the co-authors was Peter Anello, who I knew personally, and they were looking at ecology modeling software packages, and in an editorial, they were admonishing researchers not to place undue trust in the nature of these black boxes, which they essentially were functioning as, that they just, crunched their data with and generated these ecological models, and without really understanding how the data were being handled, what the underlying algorithms were. And so to demonstrate their concern, to instill some pause, they set out to test some ostensibly bogus data to see how it was treated by the algorithms, by these various software packages. And so what did they choose? They chose Sasquatch report data, which they gleaned from various sources online. What was interesting is when they crunched it, it kicked out this model of habitat and distribution that was remarkably mirrored by black bear.
Hmm.
And I mean, down to specific bioclimatic factors, which they, in their conclusions, suggested was that misidentifications of black bear then was the most likely explanation for this remarkable congruence of these two data sets. Well, in private conversations with Peter, who's very interested in Sasquatch, had done his honors project on geographic information systems applications to the analysis of Sasquatch data, report data. And anyway, he basically shared with me that had, and that I should appreciate more than anyone, had they even intimated that their results lent credibility to the Sasquatch data as a reasonable data set, that their paper wouldn't have been published. And but his co-authors were quite intrigued by the results and were actually now very interested in the question of Sasquatch. He said he had them reading my book. So that was gratifying. But anyway, but that was an interesting um, parallel. Now their study was largely focused on Western states. But if we extrapolate that to bear distribution across North America as indicative of habitat that could support a Sasquatch population as another large omnivorous primate, which at least in the West was driven by bioclimatic factors that were remarkably similar for another large omnivorous species, mammalian species, then maybe we're justified in utilizing that as sort of a rule of thumb. If you're in an area that supports a viable black bear population, then it's likely that there's sufficient habitat to support Sasquatch as well, and the vice versa. If you're not, if there haven't been any black bear ever, or not for the past 100 years, then what are the odds that there's enough resource to sustain a Sasquatch population? Now, maybe there is sufficient differentiation of the niche that isn't showing up in that particular comparison in the Western states that might apply to areas like in the Midwest. But these are wild men of the woods, not wild men of the cornfields or the wheat fields or the, you know. And so when there's no forest left to speak of,
Mhm.
I recently gave a presentation in Ohio, and part of the presentation was to walk through, let me back up, Grover. But like I said, as I said today, I have to rethink this comparison because Grover was talking about grizzly bears. But Grover said 100 bear to 1 Sasquatch.
Wow.
And I think he was, though, talking about black bear because he started off down a different. I've got to reread it more carefully. So 100 to 1. Well, I wanted to know, well, he doesn't give much basis for coming up with that other than a kind of a gut feeling about based on footprints and reports and so forth by comparison to the estimated numbers for black bear. So what I would do when I give a talk along these lines, where we look at the behavioral ecology of Sasquatch, try to make inferences of creating a scientific context within which to consider the probability of a large primate existing. One of the first questions is how many are there? Population numbers and population structure. What's their social structure? And so in order to get at this, I walk through this multi-step trying to characterize the potential habitat. You look at the landforms. You look at the precipitation map. John Green very early on had noted in his early simple tallies of statistics from his collecting of reports that there was a good correlation between very productive forests requiring probably 16 or 18 inches of annual precipitation or more. And so you look at precipitation map, you look at where are the people, what's the population density overall in areas of concentration. What are the forest types? What is the forest cover? How much development? How much fragmentation is there? And then I will have looked at a survey of the social structures exhibited by the known great apes, with the caveat that these are limited. This is a very limited sample of relic populations that are on the brink of extinction, essentially, that once were part of a much more diverse adaptive radiation. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see the diversity and the greatest similarities based on a number of things are had with orangutans, which have a solitary social structure with a male overlapping a couple of females and maybe a couple of offspring, and very rare reproduction. 6 to 9 years was the latest number I read, I think, between births. The females seek out the male, when they're receptive and ready to be impregnated. So it's pretty rare. Otherwise, they're pretty solitary. The male just advertises his presence. It's kind of like the loud calls that we attribute to Sasquatch,
Mhm.
blasting out there. Most of the footprints, most of the sightings, solitary individuals, based on the pattern of distribution and these repeat appearances of recognizable individuals. It's been suggested by a couple of people independently, a couple of investigators. One was a GIS tech himself, 1,000 square mile home range. So try to speed this up. Take that 1,000 square mile home range, which is one male and possibly two or three females, and maybe one or two dependent offspring still. So each one, let's just say five individuals. And if you look at a map then, and given the rainfall, given the development, given the forest distribution, how many of those can you reasonably kind of fit in the available habitat? And so say take Idaho, for example, it's about 15. Because the southwestern part of the state's pretty dry, still a Great Basin, and not a lot of forests until you get up a ways, the Panhandle and the eastern ranges as you get up high towards the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. 15 times 5, that's 75 Sasquatch in all of Idaho. And that's if you say, okay, well, that's too conservative. Well, even if you double it, go up to 150, I'm fine with
Yeah.
that. 150 because how you fit and it's not all even terrain and so forth. 150, there's 300, or excuse me, 35,000 black bear. If it's 100 to 1, that's 350. If it's 200 to 1, which is the number that I usually work with, then it's 175. Well, 175, 150, that's pretty darn close. I mean, you're in the ballpark.
Yeah.
You're in the infield, that's really interesting convergence. Well, then I did this for Ohio, and you turn to the bear statistics for Ohio. There's a whopping 75 black bear in Ohio. That's 1/4 of a Sasquatch.
Yeah.
So what do you want? An upper limb, or do you want light meat, dark meat? And that didn't sit really well with the audience because there's a
Right.
lot of reports.
It's like top five in the country.
Well, I know, and
Yeah.
but see, we had a little before. There was a panel discussion the next day after our presentations, and they led off first with a little town hall meeting, and they had people coming up to the mic sharing some experiences. So I was taking notes, on my phone, taking notes, and what were the stories? Someone heard a bump in the night. Someone heard a vocalization that might have been, but they didn't record it. Someone felt like they were being watched at night. And it just went, there were no footprints. There were no visual sightings. It was all this warm and fuzzy, kumbaya kind of experiences that made them think that they were experiencing Sasquatch Bigfoot activity. And I kind of pointed that out gently, saying, uh, is Ohio such a hotbed because it also happens to be the fourth most populous state in the union.
Yeah.
There's more people with more vivid imaginations and curiosity and interest. That skewing the numbers a little bit. If you eliminate all but footprints and confirmed visual, maybe with under very good conditions, or by confirmed, confidence in a visual encounter, or multiple witnesses require multiple witnesses, those numbers are going to shrink. And
Right.
I pointed out that the 75, the black bear population doesn't observe the state boundary. And if you look at, what is it, Pennsylvania and what were the other states? West Virginia and Kentucky or Arkansas, the other state that borders. Between those, there's like, oh, what was it, 22,000 black bear. So there's another, 100, 150 Sasquatch that could saunter over into Ohio once in a great while, like when there's a conference at Salt Fork Lodge or other illustrious occasions, they might pay a visit.
They might visit.
I'm
Yeah.
really going to get in trouble.
To attend the conference.
I won't. Let's see. I think I have an invitation for next year that's confirmed. So,
The
No, but these are things that people should bear in mind, should keep
yeah,
in mind when they're doing research, and
sure.
especially when, when they are out doing things, we've got to in order for this to be taken seriously. I mean, one, and some people say, I couldn't care less if the
Yeah.
scientists take it seriously. If you're just interested in an avocation, something to liven up your weekend, hey, more power to you. That's fine. But if you want to see this, if you want to be a citizen scientist and see actual progress be made towards the acknowledgement that there is this fascinating, potentially fascinating species, what's been listed as one of the top 10 questions of human evolution today. Are there other hominins living alongside us, other bipedal hominin species or hominoid species, excuse me, whichever, excuse me. But then you've got to raise the bar. You've got to hold yourself and others to a higher standard, not be worried about clicks online, or visibility on your Facebook page or whatever. But to really try to be part of I mean, because it's still, whether you're salting the mine or not, you can still have a fantastic experience out there in the field
Absolutely.
doing this kind of field work. I mean, what a place. And when I think of all the places I've spent time and been able to visit, not only here stateside and Canada, but around the world, it's amazing opportunities. So, but I would hope people would aspire to the more lofty goals, more laudable goals, I think, of a good, solid, objective investigation into an interesting phenomenon rather than flit from one paranormal story to another. And then, the upsurgence of sightings of dogmen now that is
Yeah.
I mean, all you have to do is take one step back and just look at how this has happened and contrast it, not compare it favorably, but contrast it um, with the history of Sasquatch and the nature of the evidence for the two in comparison. It's apples and oranges. I mean, it's apples and rocks, not even oranges, not even a food group. So
Has
it
anyone showed you a footprint of what they claim is a dog man?
no one documentary crew said they were sending me a chupacabra footprint, and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. And so they didn't give me much. They wanted to get my initial reaction, so they don't give you any photos or anything, but they kind of, so I was prepared. I mean, I kind of knew what to expect, just given the nature of it. So I had laid out on my bench, I had a cougar, a bobcat, I had several domestic dogs, a coyote, and a couple of gigantic wolf tracks. And we, of course, just as I expected, we opened it up, and it's a four-toed clawed paw print. And just it was kind of like the old uh, sound effect where I said, hey, you got to let me do it. I was going ding 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 ding. And it was a dead ringer. I mean, it was identical to one of my domestic dog prints. I had
Right.
made casts. We had several large dogs that people would take for walks up at the end of our lane, which at that time was a dead end and an undeveloped stretch and lots of dirt and mud. And so these, beautiful, pristine dog prints that I made numerous casts of to have as reference material. And so, I mean, I could have swapped it and they would never have known that it was a domestic dog. There was no
Right.
question it was a domestic dog. So that was the closest. I was hopeful, but uh, there was another time when someone alerted me that they had found a roadkill of a chupacabra. They were convinced it was a chupacabra. Couldn't be anything else. And they had much of the carcass. I said, well, do you have any of the face? Do you have the snout, the jaws? Do you have teeth? I said, we can figure out what it is with the teeth. He says, oh, yeah, yeah, we do. It's all kind of mummified and dried out. And this thing had been run over and hit and, road rash. And he had some snapshots of it. But anyway, and the snapshots were very telling. It was a chow, a
Mm.
big chow dog that had been run over and great chunks of hair ripped away from it. And so there were these weird patches and half its face was hairless and muscle and skin exposed. And it had broken the muzzle, the damage. So he just separated the muzzle with the upper and lower jaw and put it in a box. It was all dried, perfectly desiccated. Sent it to me, and it was very straightforward to just point out all the dental parallels to a dog, a domesticated dog. And uh, although he didn't want to accept that, those were just convergences. Those were just similarities that it just looked kind of like a dog, but it was
Sure.
really a chupacabra.
Right. So I just have two last questions for you. So
Okay. So,
obviously there's a lot of different methods that people use to, get Bigfoot activity. Like for me personally, like I've had the best experience with like tree knocks and call blasting. But if you were to tell someone like what you think the best method is, and for some people it's just going out in nature and just being yourself, right? But do you have a
yeah,
specific method that you have had experience with that you think is the best?
yeah. Well, what I would suggest lies in between those two extremes, just being yourself and going out there and doing things that we're not 100% sure that they're attributable to Sasquatch. And even if they are, we have no idea what they mean. So no one, to my knowledge, and I'd be happy to be proven wrong, has ever described having witnessed a Sasquatch smacking a stick against a tree. So what we're hearing, especially when they sound, I mean, I've only experienced a true wood knock once, and it startled me because whatever whatever it was that was responded. I don't think no, it was a wood knock. It could have been a number of things. Could have been a woodpecker. It could have been. I've always argued we got to be careful. It could be slapping the hands or just clapping the hands. Um, Especially if they have these air sacs. That's another thing. I actually came upon recently. Someone had posted a YouTube video where they videoed a gorilla, and you could actually see it inflate its chest air sac before it did the chest beat.
Oh wow.
So it
Yeah.
had a drum literally on the surface of its chest, under the skin, on top of the ribs, that it could resonate and make that, wop, 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 wop. I mean, it sounds almost like birds flapping. A grouse, if you've heard a grouse beat its wings, that percussion sound. Anyway, likewise with the vocalizations, we don't know if they're, there are, and setting aside for a moment the whole discussion about language, even if they have a vocal repertoire, they can be quite specific in the meaning of those vocalizations. I mean, they've done studies where they play, monkeys, for example, they have an alarm call for a hawk or an eagle, and they have an alarm call for a snake. And
Right.
if they record those and go out in the middle of a group of monkeys and they play the hawk or the eagle warning call, all of the monkeys look up in the air. And conversely, if they play the snake one, they all look down at the ground. So, I mean, in other words, there can be meaning conveyed. So when we get out there and either make obnoxious sounds or uh, blast a vocalization, we have no idea what we're doing. We're shooting in the dark. And so whether that is attracting or repulsive or antagonistic or conciliatory, we have no idea. So I don't know. So my suggestion is, if you have the good fortune, it sounds like you do, of places you can go on a regular basis, is that instead of always thinking the grass is greener somewhere else, is develop networks, not only with time spent in the field, but I mean also networks with agency personnel get to know your forest rangers or natural resource officers or whatever institutional officers you have access to, even local law enforcement for that matter. I mean, we had some really interesting experiences. Myself and John Meinzinski, when we blanketed Western Wyoming and sent out kind of an introductory, uh, want to call it goodie bag, for want of a better, with a copy of my book and a DVD of a National Geographic documentary that featured some of our field work, reprints of our papers, our business cards with contact information, a map of the area where sightings have occurred, marked on them, and so forth and so forth. And then followed up with visits and established that kind of a network. Now, unfortunately, we've let it. There's turnover in all of those offices on a regular basis.
Sure.
But so that's one step, but then also get familiar with your area. So you know where the fruiting shrubs are, you know where the acorns are located, or the pine nuts, or which streams have fish in them, and where other animals like river otters or bears or other, where are the resources, and where is the cover? Where are the dens? You can find animal dens. It's like it boils down to that numbers game again we were alluding to, that 100 or 200 to 1. When think about how much bear sign do you see when you go out, or if that's questionable, then how much deer sign? How many skeletal remains of a deer have you ever found in the field? And or how many snapshots of a deer in the wild? The one, not one that's habituated to the point that it's coming into neighborhoods and nibbling on grass and shrubs. I did this with one fellow one time who was in an area and lots of deer and lots of wildlife, but he was claiming and describing activity. That was a very vague, ambiguous term, on a weekly basis. He was this weekend warrior, and I rather attempted to diplomatically say to him, "Well, gee, you must really have a knack for interacting with wildlife, even rare and elusive wildlife." I said, "Why don't you, next time you're out next weekend, get me a picture of a deer? In fact, make it a buck. Make it a buck with, good rack, 4-point buck. That should be no problem. I mean, if you're bumping into Sasquatch on a weekly basis, you must be seeing deer and raccoons and possums on just hand over fist." Well, it started to sink in, my point, because he wasn't seeing wildlife like that.
Right.
And so the unspoken admonition is, if you're not seeing sign of other animals that are 100-fold, 200-fold, or in case of deer, multiple of that, as common as a Sasquatch, what are the odds of you, bumping into one last one? I was working with a gentleman, who was facilitating. I was kind of acting in the capacity of a consultant and co-worker, and he was providing opportunity with not only resources and so forth, but making it possible to go into the field and do this stuff. And one time he decided his biggest problem was, or the biggest challenge, I shouldn't say it's not a problem per se, but biggest challenge was he was a bit of a butterfly. He would flit from one blossom to the other every time something would come to his attention. And I was trying to instill this notion of stationary network establishing, dogged, persistent hunting. And so finally he said one time he wanted to look into something closer to my neck of the woods. He said, "Surely there must be some areas in Idaho that you're interested in that you haven't looked at yet." So we picked some place out. But the point was, we were going on a preliminary survey He agreed to do that first before he made a big commitment, and so we were limiting the number of vehicles and so forth, and the expense, and so we were carpooling. And I get into his car, and he turns to me as we're driving down the highway, and so Jeff, what do you think our odds are for this trip? And I just, laughed like that. I kind of chuckled because we're still having this same conversation. What are the odds? And I said, well, pull over to that quick stop and let's buy a few scratch cards and then let's talk about it. I said, we have about as much luck, much
Right.
chance rather, as hitting it big on a scratch card. But if we don't stop and buy a few, we'll never know, will we? And the more cards we buy, the greater our chances are going to be. But they're still kind of remote. If we have everything prepared, and I've done lots of research. I mean, I sat and worked with Google Earth. I walked up and down every stream, every drainage, every sandbar that I, snapshot of from Google Earth. And I said, so I know the lay of the land. I know where we have a good chance maybe of finding tracks, blah, 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 and so on. And if we have everything right and all our equipment works as it's supposed to, and we have no glitches, no gremlins in the works, but that one Sasquatch that's resident in that valley that I've picked out happens to decide to go over the ridge into the next valley, and we're only going to be in this valley for 10 days to 14 days, we're SOL.
Right.
Simple as that. We're not going to see anything. And I said, that's what we're up against. So, that's why we're very eager to try to investigate the application of things like drones. And eventually, although at that time it was still kind of in its infancy, environmental DNA, to cast the net more broadly, and try to, because you cannot just boots on the ground. Look at the reports, the credible reports, not the weak claims of weekend warriors, but the credible, substantiatable reports are absolutely by chance. They're totally serendipitous, almost without exception. And even, Patterson, they were there. People think, oh, they just showed up and, got him on the camera. No, they were there
They were there a while.
logging for weeks
Yeah.
and driving all the roads and riding up and down and out at night and in the middle of the night and doing it in a place where there had been footprints found just a few weeks earlier, an extensive set of unmistakable footprints, really. So anyway, that's just some food for thought. People need to keep in mind. Again, I don't want to dampen the enthusiasm of anybody that's getting out there and doing this kind of thing, but you've got to love the process because your chances of success are pretty slim. They're really, really reasonably
Oh yeah.
pretty
Absolutely.
slim. I mean, look, I've been doing it for 28 years now, thereabouts, and can count the number of times that I've seen footprints on my one hand and so on. Anyway,
Well, other question, you kind of answered a little bit, but like what enhancements in technology you think are
yeah,
needed or that are out now that you think will help get, that next Patterson Gimlin film or the next like evidence
yeah,
that's just without a doubt.
right. Well, I have said now for several years running that I see two approaches that are that probably hold the greatest potential. And one, and I mentioned both those briefly, but let's talk about them. So one is drone technology. We had kind of an ill-fated project that I've taken lots of flack for being only associated with, not responsible for, but only associated with. And that was what was called the Falcon Project, a lighter than air ship. And it was a project that was far too ambitious, really,
Mm.
impractical. It wasn't impossible, but it was just not very practical. And given the potential limitations and challenges, something that expensive is just not the way to work the kinks out of a system and approach. A $200,000 airship is just, you can't afford to crash it into the treetops, or down into a remote canyon or whatever. Anyway, not to mention the extremely expensive camera equipment that was intended to be loaded onto that. We still have the challenge of penetrance when it comes to thermal imaging. Now, another potential area is LiDAR, which can penetrate the canopy to a degree, at least. And I mean, you hear the stories of all the LiDAR surveys of Mesoamerica and finding these jungles that are covering what are now these vast metropolises with pyramids and buildings and sprawling highways and so forth that are completely masked from view, with the exception of the occasional hillock here and there. Turns out to be a pyramid underneath there. Anyway, but LiDAR is another. I've been on the phone with techs, and I've been very forthright with my interest in the technology. And can we differentiate a 800-pound gorilla under the forest canopy? Not yet, but they're quickly getting to the point. They said, it's just a matter of months, if not years, or years, if not months. Like a better way to say that you'll be able to pick out, here's the moose, here's the bear, here's the Bigfoot.
Wow.
And so, so I think those it's a little ways off. And likewise, the air times are increasing. The more practical is the multi-copter approach, but those are limited by the amount of air time. Long systematic surveys are not the right now. The multi-copters are a what's the word? They have it in law enforcement, but they're the quick response. One of the best applications, if you haven't seen it, it's cool to watch it and just imagine this happening with the Sasquatch. But I'm so terrible with names now anymore, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember his name. He's the grandson of one of the discoverers of the Sela Gallant. Anyway, he had a show, Extinct or Still Living, I think was the name of the show, and where he would look for these supposedly recently extinct species to see if they were still maybe hanging around. One of them, the one that I'm referring to, were these white wolves up in Labrador, and they were trying to get images of it, but he had set up a lure with this, just kind of a rabbit's piece of rabbit fur that's on a wire that just flicks it around and does a little game call, distress call. And then he's in his blind, all tucked in with his thermal camera and a video camera, apparently, or combination thereof. But he caught a glimpse of a flash of fur. And the camera crew is bivouacked back out away from the lure. He jumps up and he runs back and he gets them awake, and they're supposed to be on the ready, and up goes the drone with the thermal camera. And the forest up there is pretty stunted. They're up in northern latitudes there, and it's on the border of the tundra. It's the boreal forest, but kind of stunted trees, and so it's not an impenetrable canopy, which to their advantage. But up goes this drone, and it's scanning around. All of a sudden, here's these two wolves, just perfectly outlined in the thermal image, racing between the trees. And the drone zips over and follows them a bit. I just thought, oh man, that's perfect, because it's that quick reaction, extending your view beyond what he could have possibly witnessed, other than that simple flash of fur. But just imagine if that was a Sasquatch. You got a glimpse of an upright figure that disappears in the trees, sent his crew up to catch that image. So drones, thermal imaging. I mean, eventually the military grade's going to be on the shelf and we'll be able to penetrate through the canopy, probably, or at least through some undergrowth. And LiDAR. And then the other direction, the other fork, I think, is eDNA
Right.
and
Environmental.
environmental DNA. Because again, instead of just trying to get an animal to engage a snare to get fresh tissue from that animal, you get the fragments of DNA from that have accumulated over a longer period of time, potentially from multiple animals. The only caveat is, and this is, when people say, well, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? Because you got to stop and think about all the caveats and challenges. And that is much of the sample from the environment is going to be degraded. You don't get a pristine, unbroken strand of DNA to sequence from start to finish. You get fragments that have to be sequenced, and these algorithms used that piece these things together and try to reassemble the genome DNA sequence. Well, then we're back to square one as far as the challenge of doing a DNA analysis. For one, I mean, you've got the added challenge of trying to recompose this sample, but once you get it, you're comparing it to us, and
Sure.
we may differ by 0.5%, 0.25%. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And so, unless you've got a lot of confidence in your reconstruction, and or you happen to get the right scratch ticket that has the genetic marker that distinguishes them from us, that makes a Sasquatch instead of a human, what's the result going to be? Well, that sample's another human contaminant again, which is what we've run into up to this point. On those rare occasions that DNA has been retrieved from a hair sample, invariably it comes back as human. Well, my question, and they attribute it to either misidentification, misapprehension of a human hair out in the wild, or contamination from improper handling of the specimen. But the other possibility is you just didn't sequence enough
Right.
to be able to come to that conclusion.
That makes sense.
So there's a couple of other interesting potential twists, but I'll not get into that. But there's a paper, if someone wants to really dig into it, there's a paper that's posted, and this is a good opportunity to give a plug for the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, which is an online refereed journal that I edit with the assistance of an editorial board of bona fide scientists, PhDs, and professionals of appropriate expertise. And we're in our 13th year. There's quite an accumulation now of research articles, peer-reviewed research articles, in-depth book reviews, essay-style book reviews, news and comments and reactions, and translations of historical foreign papers, and so forth and so forth. But there's one in there that addresses the potential of mitochondrial introgression. You have to look that up. It's about a year or two old now, but an interesting paper that poses a possible explanation for why every time we test the DNA with a preliminary test, which is always mitochondrial genes, because they're easier to get at, the protocols are more straightforward, there's more mitochondria, easier to amplify the DNA, it comes back as human. And this paper grapples with one possible explanation and provides some interesting comparison examples that might explain why that continues to happen, and admonishes us to now look not just at the mitochondria, but the nuclear genes. That may be where the tell is located.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Meldrum, thank you so much for talking to me. It's definitely been an honor. Like I said, like I grew up like watching you on TV on like these Bigfoot shows, so it's really cool to actually get to talk to you. And I know you have some books. I mean, you have the so you're about to release another one, right? So you
Well, not,
Legends Meet Science.
yeah. Legend Means Science is out there. I've written a couple of field guides,
Okay.
one about Sasquatch and one about relic hominoids around the world, which is kind of the abstract to another major book I'm working on, but keeps getting sidebarred because of other
Mhm.
projects. I just completed a series of learning activity books for young readers to introduce the next generation or a couple generations down, to the subject matter. But they're very engaging for adults as well. I have adults buy them for their kids, and they end up sitting and reading them. And,
Sure.
but there's games and activities and so forth, learning activities that my wife helped me put together, she being an elementary school teacher for
Mm.
many, many years. I'm now working on Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2, which is the sequel to the original. Doug Hychek, the producer of the original documentary, is now doing a follow-up documentary.
Oh,
What's
cool.
happened in the past 2 decades? What advances have been made? What new technologies are being applied? Any new forms of evidence or insights to expanded data sets? And so I'm writing the companion volume to that as well. So I'm working on that, but it's not soon to be released.
Okay.
It'll be next year sometime
Right.
probably. It's the writing's moving along this summer, but it's going to take a while.
So where can someone go if they want to buy like any of your books, field guides?
I would recommend, I mean, you can go to Amazon, obviously, and
Yeah.
search, but I would recommend an alternate, which is Paradise K Publishers. And their website is Paracay, PARACAY.com. A K is an inlet or a bay.
Hmm.
They're out of Arcata, California. They started off as a little publishing house that did coastal maps and guidelines, field guides to seashore wildlife and so forth, and grew and grew and grew and grew until well, everything's online, but they do have a print catalog that's, half an inch thick. And they are fascinated. The proprietor, Jim Morehouse, is fascinated with Sasquatch. So there's a whole string of Sasquatch related things. So in addition to my books and titles, you can find some really fun items ranging from fridge magnets to oh, you name it. There's all kinds of interesting art pieces and badges and patches and stickers and paraphernalia. So paracay.com,
Okay.
but my books and field guides and
Cool.
activity books are to be found there.
Cool. Well, like I said, thank you so much, Dr. Meldrum. It's been a privilege, an honor.
Pleasure. Likewise.